Chapter 5. Matt. Rochelle's not answering her phone, Jessica said to Matt the next morning. Working in his office, he turned to her with confusion. Who? Rochelle? From work? He still didn't know what she was talking about. Okay. She dragged her hands through her hair. When I called her last night, she was sick. She was going to the doctor this morning, but she's not answering her phone. Knowing Brooke's mother had died from the flu, Matt understood why Jessica was worried. Still, he didn't want her to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was in with the doctor when you called. Jessica's face relaxed a little. Maybe. She pulled her phone out of her pocket. I'll text her and ask her to call me. She gave him a quick kiss. Sorry to bother you. He smiled. You never bother me. She returned his smile. I'll let you get back to work. Later that morning, the doorbell rang. Ready for a break, Matt got to the door in time to see the UPS driver walking away from the packages he'd left on the porch. Watching the man through the side lights beside the front door, when the driver lifted his hand to his mouth and had a coughing fit, Matt recoiled. He couldn't bring the packages inside. The virus could be all over them. Are those our packages from Amazon? Jessica asked. The kids were right behind her. Who is that? Dylan asked. Frowning, Matt turned to them. Yes, it's our packages, but I think the delivery guy was sick. He was coughing up a lung. You can't bring them in, Kayla said, her eyebrows bunched. I mean, what if the delivery guy has the virus? Could we get it? Concern filled her eyes. I don't want to get sick. Matt stepped away from the still-closed front door and went to Kayla before pulling her into a hug. He knew she was thinking of Brooke and her family. Besides, he agreed. We'll do everything we can to stay healthy. He stepped back. Any ideas? He glanced at Dylan to include him in the question. Dylan, who usually made fun of his sister at every opportunity, was uncharacteristically helpful. What if we leave them on the porch for a few hours? Won't the virus die? Kayla didn't look convinced, but Matt smiled. That's actually a good idea, Dylan. Dylan grinned under the compliment. How long does it take for the virus to die? Kayla asked, her eyes tight with worry. I'm not sure, Matt said. Let me look it up. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and Googled the question. Moments later, he frowned as he looked at Kayla. This virus can live on hard surfaces for up to 24 hours. Jessica looked thoughtful. What if we spray some disinfectant on the boxes? Do you really think that would kill the virus? Dylan asked. Looking grim, Jessica shrugged. I don't know. Or we can wait until tomorrow to bring them in. And risk someone stealing them off our porch? Matt shook his head. They had important supplies in those boxes. He wasn't about to risk someone taking them. The way things were going, he was becoming more convinced by the minute that all the things he'd bought 2 days earlier, plus the items on their porch, would become vital, especially as the news reported increasing fatality rates. Jessica sighed, clearly stressed by all that was happening. What do you want to do? That's when Matt got an idea. Wait here. I'll be right back. He went out to their RV, which was stored in the side yard, took a small box out of the storage area, and came back into the house. He held up the box of disposable gloves that he used when emptying the RV's waste tanks. Problem solved. What are you gonna do? Dylan asked, his face bright with interest. Matt put on a pair of the blue disposable gloves and a face mask. Then he went to the laundry room where the cleaning supplies were stored. He took out a spray bottle of disinfectant and carried it back to where his family waited. I got this, he said with a grin. He went into the garage and pressed the opener. Once the garage had rumbled open, he went to the front porch, sprayed a generous mist of disinfectant over the boxes that sat on the porch, then carried them one by one, careful to hold the boxes away from his body into the garage. When he was done, he tossed the gloves in the trash, closed the garage, and went inside where he washed his hands with soapy water before putting the face mask aside and turning to his family with a triumphant smile. "We'll leave them in the garage for at least 24 hours. "Dad," Dylan said with an ear-splitting grin, "you're a genius." "That was pretty smart," Kayla said. Jessica wrapped her arms around him. "I knew I married you for more than your good looks." Enjoying the accolades from his family, he laughed. Chapter 6. Jessica. Jessica hadn't heard back from Rochelle. She'd made several other attempts throughout the day to call her, but each time the call had gone straight to voicemail. Concerned, but not knowing what to do, she hoped Rochelle would finally get in touch with her and tell her she was okay. That evening, as Jessica was making dinner, Kayla came into the kitchen. "Mom?" "Hi, honey." She put the casserole in the oven and set the timer for 30 minutes. "Mom, I don't know what to do." She turned to face her. "About what?" Kayla sighed. "Brooke keeps asking me if I can come over." "No." The words left Jessica's mouth without thought. Eyes widening at Jessica's tone, Kayla said, "I know I can't go over there, but what should I tell her? I mean, her mom died and now her dad's sick." Thoughts of Rochelle, sick the night before, filled her mind. Oh no. Her expression must have broadcast her worry because tears filled Kayla's eyes. "He's going to die, isn't he?" Jessica rushed to Kayla and put her arms around her. "Not necessarily, sweetheart. Not everyone who gets sick dies." She desperately hoped that was right. Kayla stepped back, her eyes wet and her eyebrows tugging together. "Yes, they do. I read it online. Had the fatality rate climbed higher? Where did you read that?" Kayla took her phone out of her pocket, tapped something into the screen, then showed it to Jessica, who read the headline. "Fatality rate skyrockets to 95%. Terror slammed through her. Pressing a hand to her chest, she found it hard to catch her breath. She had to talk to Matt, had to discuss what to do. But first, she needed to comfort Kayla. She put an arm around Kayla's shoulder as they both stared at the ominous words. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Everyone's going to die, aren't they? Even us." Jessica met Kayla's gaze. "No, no, no. That's why we've quarantined ourselves. To stay healthy. To stay alive." Kayla's forehead creased like she didn't quite believe her. "I'm gonna call Brooke." Jessica loved Kayla's compassion. "Good idea. She needs all the support you can give her." The moment Kayla cleared the room, Jessica hustled into Matt's office. It looked like he was deep into coding, and though she didn't want to interrupt him when he was in the flow, this couldn't wait. "I have some news." He spun his chair to face her, his expression guarded. "Bad news?" Jessica frowned. "That's all we seem to have lately." "What is it?" "Brooke's dad is sick now." Matt's forehead furrowed. "Oh no." "Yeah, evidently the fatality rate is now 95%. His eyebrows shot up. "What?" She gave him the web address for the site Kayla had shown her, and they looked it up together. With a more thorough read, the news was even worse than Jessica had at first realized. Not only had the fatality rate skyrocketed, but the virus was spreading extremely fast. Matt turned to her, his expression sober. "You realize what this means, don't you?" A million thoughts flew through Jessica's mind, but she didn't want to give voice to a single one of them. Still, she had to know what Matt was thinking. "What?" "This thing could lead to collapse." She knew what he was saying, but she didn't want to accept it. "What kind of collapse? What do you mean?" His face was grim. "Total societal collapse." "From the flu? No." She shook her head in denial. "No, that can't happen, Matt. Why are you saying that?" "Think about it, Jess." He held up his hand and touched a finger. If enough people die, who's going to deliver food to the stores? He touched a second finger, and then a third. Who's going to run the water treatment facilities? The sewage treatment facilities? He touched a fourth. Who's going to keep the electrical grid going? Panic, powerful and swift, crashed over her. How could a little flu bug lead to all of that? But not everyone is getting sick. Matt gazed at her. Do you think anyone who's healthy is going to want to go to work? He gestured to the programming code on his computer screen to emphasize his point. I'm not. Can't they work from home too? He tilted his head like he didn't want to point out the obvious because it was such a horrible truth, but he had no choice. There are only so many people who know how to run the utility companies, and it's unlikely all of them will survive this. And those who do probably have to be at the facility to do their job. He frowned. Then there are the truck drivers who deliver food to the stores. Do you think those who survive will want to be out among the sick? And you know stores only have a few days' worth of food in stock. Matt shook his head, his lips lifting in a grim smile. Good thing we stocked up when we did. If there's so much as a single bottle of ketchup on the shelves at this point, I'd be shocked. As it dawned on Jessica how this had the potential to turn into an absolute nightmare, she felt her face pale. How bad do you think it's going to get? Her voice was soft, like if she didn't say it very loud, it might not happen. Matt grimaced. We haven't even discussed law enforcement. What do you mean? Those officers have families of their own. Don't you think they'll want to protect them from all the chaos? Sure, there might be a few out there trying to uphold the law, but how long do you think that will last? You're really scaring me, Matt. He placed his hand on her knee. We need to be prepared for the worst. He gazed at her. That includes the kids. Jessica thought about her kids and how their lives were about to change. If they survived the flu, that is. The thought horrified her. The timer went off in the kitchen. Glad for an excuse to end this disturbing conversation, she stood. Dinner's ready. Chapter 7. Matt. Matt followed Jessica into the kitchen, his mind on all the horrible things he'd told her. He deeply hoped society would make it through, but he feared a collapse was inevitable. Mom, Dad, Dylan said from the family room. Come see this. His tone was laced with unease. What is it? Matt asked, walking into the family room and standing behind the couch where Dylan was sitting. Dylan pointed to the TV and turned up the volume. Matt's eyes went to the flat screen mounted on the wall. It was breaking news. The anchor, a woman who was on every night, was calmly sharing the latest information on the flu with a video showing people, some of them wearing ear-loop masks, fighting over nearly empty shelves at grocery stores. The video changed from one location to another, covering cities in multiple states, but the story was the same over and over. Hospitals are full, the anchor stated, so if you have symptoms, the best place for you and your loved ones is at home. They don't want people to spread it, Dylan said. Then he looked at Matt. Right? Matt set a hand on Dylan's shoulder. Yeah, I think you're right. If anyone in your home has died, authorities ask that you mark your house by painting a red X on your front door or putting a red sheet of paper in your front window. They also ask that you wrap any dead bodies in a sheet until the authorities can collect them. Repelled at the idea, Matt stared at the TV. Dinner's ready, Jessica called from the nearby kitchen. Matt turned and looked at her. Anxiety was etched on her face. It's ready, she said again, as if feeding their family was the only thing she could handle just then. Go get your sister, Matt told Dylan. Once Dylan had left the room, Matt turned off the TV and went into the kitchen. You saw the news? Jessica nodded. but kept her gaze focused on the salad she was tossing. Uh-huh. A few minutes later, the four of them sat around the dining room table, each of them lost in their own thoughts.
Brooke said her dad?
Kayla's voice broke.
She said he looks like her mom did right before she died.
Tears overflowed Kayla's lashes.
She's going to be an orphan.
Kayla glanced at Dylan.
She doesn't even have any brothers or sisters. It's just her.
Jessica leapt to her feet and raced to Kayla's side, wrapping her arms around her.
I'm so sorry, sweetheart.
Matt watched helplessly as Kayla sobbed and Jessica comforted her. After a moment, he went to them and put his arms around them both. After several minutes, Kayla calmed and they went back to their seats, but no one seemed to be hungry. Even Dylan, who usually ate whatever was placed in front of him. Matt didn't want to add to everyone's distress, but he needed to have a serious talk with his family. Family meeting after dinner. His tone was grim. Everyone looked at him with furrowed brows. Compressing his lips, he met all of their gazes. I know you might not be all that hungry right now, but we need to eat while we can.
Matt,
Jessica started. But he shook his head. He wasn't ready to discuss this until after dinner. A soft sigh slipped from Jessica's lips, but he ignored it and focused on finishing every bite on his plate. After the dinner dishes were cleaned up, the family gathered in the family room, their faces anxious. Jessica sat next to Matt on the love seat. Kayla and Dylan sat on the couch. Matt looked at the faces of his children. Kayla was barely old enough to drive, and Dylan was just starting to get zits. Still so young, but it was his responsibility to make sure they were as prepared as possible. As you've seen for yourselves, things have changed. Drastically. Tears filled Kayla's eyes, but Matt could tell she was doing her best to keep her emotions in check. We've done a few things to prepare, he said, but there are things you need to know. He turned to Jessica, whose eyebrows had tugged together. He knew she had to be thinking about their conversation before dinner. Would it be too much to share his fears with his children? Maybe so. He could give them hints without going into too much detail, though. Enough to prepare them without scaring them to death. What? Dylan asked. Matt turned his attention back to the kids. If things don't change, if people keep, he looked at Kayla, dying, well, things are going to get rough. I already know, Dylan said. Matt narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? I've seen The Walking Dead, Dad. I know what can happen. This isn't like that. Dylan snorted a laugh. Right. No zombies. It's not funny, Kayla said, as she gave her brother a shove. He turned to her, his face somber and his voice gentle. I know. Kayla's lips lifted in a tiny smile, like she knew her brother hadn't meant any harm. Deciding to let the kids steer the conversation, Matt asked, What do you think is going to happen, Dylan? Dylan glanced at Kayla, then he faced Matt and Jessica. A lot of people are going to die? He bit his lip. Maybe even us. We're doing everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen, Matt assured him. I know, he said, but it's possible. Matt couldn't argue with that. Still, he wanted to reassure him. As you know, we've self-quarantined, and we'll do our best to stay safe until this flu has run its course. Will it? Kayla asked. Run its course, I mean? This wasn't something Matt could be sure of, but he drew on past history. There have been pandemics before, and they always come to an end. Eventually. But how long will it take? Kayla persisted. Matt turned to Jessica as if she would have an answer. She looked back at him, then she pulled out her phone. Let's look it up, she said, her voice businesslike. She read her screen, then looked at him and the kids. Past pandemics have taken a few weeks to several months to run their course.
Are you saying we have to stay locked in our house for months?
Kayla asked, her face incredulous. Let's hope not, Matt said. Glad that was her main concern. That's not the biggest problem, Dylan said. And here we go. Kayla turned to her brother. Okay, what's the biggest problem? Because I don't think I can stand staring at your face for months. Dylan's eyebrows shot up like he was offended. Then he shook his head like his sister was an idiot. You'll be lucky if that's your biggest problem. He smiled and ran his fingers through his hair. Besides, I'm one handsome guy. Kayla snorted and turned away. Yeah, right. Dylan looked slightly hurt. I am. Yes, you are, Jessica said. Dylan grinned. Glad his kids still had a sense of humor, Matt smiled. Back to the subject at hand. He looked at the kids. Tell me what you think we're in for. Worst case scenario, Dylan said. No food, no water, no power, no cops. That about covers it. Kayla's gaze shot to Matt, her eyes wide. Is that true? We don't know if that's what will happen, Jessica said, before Matt had a chance to respond. But what if it does? Kayla's forehead was creased, like she had no doubt that's exactly what would happen. That's why we're having this meeting, Matt said, with a glance at Jessica, who stared at him like she hoped he wouldn't go there. He turned to Kayla and Dylan. That's why I wanted you to eat your dinner whether you were hungry at that moment or not. We have a good supply of food and we have a decent supply of water, but I think it would be a good idea to fill all of our pitchers with water as well. Plus, I'll fill the RV's fresh water tank. Kayla's phone chimed a text. She glanced at the screen, then her eyes went wide and she cried, No! What's wrong? Matt asked. Kayla looked at him, her face filled with shock.
Brooke's dad died.
Chapter 8. Jessica. Jessica had feared that Brooke's father wouldn't make it, that it was inevitable he would die, but she'd held out hope nonetheless. Now that hope was gone. She stood from the love seat and went to Kayla, wrapping her arms around her as Kayla sobbed.
Brooke's an orphan,
Kayla moaned.
An actual orphan? Her mom and dad are dead. We're all gonna die.
The hysteria in her voice rose with each sentence, and all Jessica could do was hold her and murmur that everything would be all right.
No, it won't,
Kayla said as she pushed Jessica away.
Nothing will ever be all right. Not anymore.
Kayla was completely right. Jessica didn't see any point in arguing against what they all knew to be true. All she could do was stay by Kayla's side with her arm around her shoulder.
I don't want to talk anymore,
Kayla whispered. I think we've done enough talking for one night, Matt said, much to Jessica's relief. They put on a favorite movie, a comedy from years past, but there was very little laughter as the four of them stared at the TV. The movie seemed so pointless. People were dying. How could they sit there watching such an inane show? Holding back a sigh, Jessica excused herself and went into her bedroom and called her mother. Hi, honey, her mom said, her voice sounding less cheerful than it had when she'd spoken to her last. In fact, it sounded like it was well on the way to how Rochelle's voice had sounded. How are you? Not good, baby. Tense with worry, Jessica asked. What's wrong? I don't know. Earlier today, I started to feel unwell. Scratchy throat, aches and pains, that kind of thing. Dread spiked within her. Do you have a fever? I don't think so. I mean, I've been so chilled. Jessica thought of both of Brooke's parents dying, of Rochelle being sick, and now not answering her phone, of the fatality rate skyrocketing to 95%. Tears flooded her eyes, and a sob leapt up her throat. "It's okay, baby," her mom said. "I'm sure I'll be just fine." Had her mom not seen the news? Or was she trying to placate her? Either way, the thought of losing her mom tore her apart. "Jessica, are you there?" "Yes," she croaked out. "Oh, sweetheart, don't cry. I'll see you in a few days, and we'll have a great time." Jessica didn't have the heart to tell her mom that there was no way she would get on an airplane, trapped in a metal tube with recirculated air and potentially sick people. Besides, she knew the chance that her mother would survive was extremely low, especially with how weak the cancer had made her. "I love you, Mom. I know, sweet girl. I love you too. I always have." Her mom sniffled. "You're my heart." Her mom knew she was going to die. A fresh sob welled up inside Jessica. She needed to get herself under control, needed to take this time to talk to her mom. Breathing deeply, she gathered her emotions. "Tell me about that quilt you've been working on, the one you sent me a picture of. The one with the flowers?" Jessica nodded, overcome with emotion once again. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, it's coming along beautifully." Jessica listened as her mother spoke, soaking up every word, every syllable, listening to her mom talk until she said, "You know, honey, I'm feeling really tired. I'm going to bed now. Let's talk in the morning." Knowing full well that by morning her mom would most likely be dead. For a moment, Jessica couldn't catch her breath. It felt as if a band had wrapped around her chest and was compressing, compressing, compressing. "Good night, my love," her mom said, sounding exhausted. Rallying, Jessica said, "Good night, Mom. I love you. I love you too. Sleep well." With that, all was silent. Her mom had disconnected the call. That was when Jessica let the sobs overtake her, bathing her face in tears. Chapter 9. Jessica. After lying awake most of the night, Jessica got up before the sun, tiptoed out of her bedroom, went into the family room, and dialed her mother. The phone rang and rang. It was no more than she'd expected, although she'd held on to the hope that her mother would answer. She left a message, asking her mom to call her the moment she woke, then climbed back into bed. "No answer?" Matt asked. She'd told him and the kids about her mom the night before, in an attempt to prepare them for the worst. Silently, she shook her head. He wrapped her in his arms. "I'm so sorry." Savoring the warmth of his body curled around hers, she turned her thoughts to him and their children. A burst of gratitude that they were healthy swept over her, and she knew, somehow, that her mom was at peace. The next afternoon, as Jessica was in the basement storage room organizing all the food Matt had bought, Dylan came bursting into the room. "Mom!" he said, his voice breathless. Knowing it would be bad news, Jessica dreaded asking, but did anyway. "What is it, honey?" "No airplanes are allowed to fly." She tilted her head in question. "What are you talking about?" "They said so on the news, just now." She followed Dylan up the stairs and into the family room, where the news was broadcasting. A camera was panning a huge airport where airplanes were parked everywhere. "Still no word on when planes will be back in the air," the news anchor said. "But unnamed sources say all planes will be grounded indefinitely due to the spread of what is now being called the bird flu." "What do airplanes have to do with the flu?" Dylan asked. "Well, if someone is sick and gets on the plane, they can pass the flu on to the other passengers, who can then pass it on to everyone they come into contact with. Before you know it, It's spread all over the world. Don't you think it's already spread all over the world? I mean, it's been going on for a week, and people have been flying all over the world the whole time. Dylan was right, and Jessica knew it. Grounding the planes might help slow the spread, but stopping it now was impossible. I don't know, she said, not wanting to alarm Dylan unnecessarily. The news anchor turned to her guest, a man from the World Health Organization, who basically said the same thing that Dylan had. See? Dylan said with a proud smile. Yup, she ruffled his hair. You're one smart kid. Dylan's eyebrows rose. I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. Jessica was beginning to realize that, because with the way the world was crashing all around them, he and Kayla were going to have to grow up fast. I know, sweetheart, she said. Then she went to Matt's office to tell him what she'd just learned. His door was closed, and she could hear talking. Not wanting to interrupt if he was in a conference call, she slowly twisted the doorknob and opened the door a crack. But when she saw that he was watching the news on his monitor, she walked in and closed the door behind her. He turned at her approach. I just heard about the planes. Might be a little too late to stop this thing. She frowned as she pulled a chair up to Matt's desk so they could watch the broadcast together. I've been doing inventory on all the food and supplies in the storage room. Matt turned the volume down and faced her. And how are we looking? For a change, she had good news. Pretty good, she grinned. You did awesome with your shopping. One side of his mouth quirked up. That's a first. She leaned forward and kissed him on the mouth. I love you. I love you too. Then he gazed at her. We're going to get through this. All four of us. As scared as she was, and as sad as she was about her mom, she couldn't allow herself to think anything but positive thoughts. As long as we stick together, we'll be fine. Matt nodded. Tell me more about our inventory. Glad to talk about something tangible, Jessica said. With what you bought the other day, plus that 6-month supply of freeze-dried food we bought a few years ago, we're actually in great shape. That's fantastic. Both their gazes went to the computer monitor, which was still showing the news broadcast. It was 5 o'clock. Time for an update. Matt turned up the volume. A man they'd never seen on that news station sat in the anchor's chair, his expression stoic. He's new, Jessica said, as a sense of foreboding washed over her. Good evening, the man said. My name is Kevin Burns. I'm a producer, not a reporter, but today I am filling Amy Hunter's shoes, so to speak, because she is... The man's chin quivered slightly, but he held it together. Amy Hunter passed away this morning. Jessica shook her head. Another illness, another death. Kevin Burns stared into the camera. Last night, Amy came down with the bird flu, and, frowning, he looked at the surface of his desk before facing the camera again. That is how quickly this virus kills. He visibly swallowed. I have to be honest with you folks. Amy is not the first person at this news station to die from the bird flu. He paused. I fear she won't be the last. Kevin was silent for several seconds. We will continue broadcasting and bringing you the news as long as possible. We can get by on a skeleton crew if needed, but his jaw worked. We've lost a lot of our people, and many others are too scared to come in. A grim smile tugged up the corners of his mouth. I don't blame them. But like I said, we are here to keep you apprised of what is happening in our community and country and around the world, and we will do that for as long as we are able. Pounding on their front door startled Jessica. Matt raised his eyebrows, then stood and headed out of the office. Jessica followed close behind.